What's going on, everybody? Kalipa's Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the Motorola Moto G Power 2022 about a year after my original review and going over whether or not it's still a good phone to buy at this point. Now, if you do end up wanting to learn more about this phone, definitely check out the description where I will be linking to several other videos about it, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. So with this phone, we're getting a 6.5-inch 90Hz IPS LCD display with a 720p resolution, a PPI of 270, and a 20:9 aspect ratio. So for what it is, the display is definitely decent. At 6.5 inches, while being pretty much the industry standard at this point, the display is still decently large. So if you're going to be on your phone a good amount doing stuff like web browsing, reading, or maybe consuming content like watching videos, for example, no matter what you're doing, you are going to get a decently good experience. Things are going to be reasonably large and easy to see, so definitely not bad. With the 20:9 aspect ratio, again, this is pretty standard, but it is a decently tall and narrow form factor. So with this phone, you are going to get a pretty good scrolling experience. And if you're doing something in landscape mode like watching videos or looking at photos, for example, things are going to be decently immersive and a bit more cinematic. So overall, again, I don't really have any complaints here. Aside from the size and dimensions, when it comes to the image quality, despite definitely not being the best out there, it is still pretty decent. Even though we are only getting a 720p resolution here, things do look decently sharp. The colors are nice and bright. The viewing angles are pretty good too, and while it's still probably going to be a bit hard to see out in the sun or really in any bright area, in a more normal indoor setting, things are going to be decently bright, and again, you will get a pretty good experience. In addition to this, with a 90Hz refresh rate, of course, the movement on the screen is going to be a bit faster and smoother, making the phone feel a little bit more premium to use. Now, at this point in 2023, I want to say pretty much every phone that's coming out also has a 90Hz refresh rate. While it was a little bit less common in the beginning of 2022, at this point, I want to say it's pretty much a standard. So definitely nothing unique, but in general, if you are looking for a more affordable entry-level phone and you want to have a decent display, then compared to a lot of other phones out there, I do think the Moto G Power 2022 is pretty good. For storage, this phone is getting 64GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion, so definitely nice to see here. I'm glad it's not getting 32 because a lot of really affordable 4G phones like this only have 32, and at this point in 2023, I feel like 32GB is really not enough for anyone. But with 64, although I personally consider this more bare minimum for the average user, as long as you're mindful of what you're putting on your phone and you make sure to use a microSD card whenever you can, 64 should be perfectly fine. That being said though, if you're someone who's constantly downloading a bunch of apps, games, stuff like that, or maybe you just never want to have to worry about storage, if that's you, you're probably going to want even more storage than this, because 64GB, while again being at least decent for the average user, is still going to fill up pretty quickly if you're putting a lot of stuff on it. Now for security features, this phone does have Face Unlock, as well as a fingerprint scanner right here on the power key, so definitely nice we're getting both options here. At this point in 2023, pretty much every phone like this has both a fingerprint scanner and Face Unlock, but when this phone originally came out, it was a little bit less common, but at the end of the day, it's probably not that big a deal either way. I imagine most people are going to be using the fingerprint scanner and maybe not Face Unlock, but just keep in mind again, if you do want to use Face Unlock, it is an option on this phone. But let's give the fingerprint scanner a try. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So real fast and responsive, no issues at all. Now for the camera setup here, we got a nice looking water drop notch for the front facing camera. When it comes to entry level phones, well, it's definitely not rare per se. A lot of entry level phones, in fact, I want to say most of them actually, are still going to have a water drop notch instead. And with the hole punch, while it still does kind of show up, I feel like it's a lot less intrusive. So I definitely like this design a lot better. Now this camera is 8 megapixels. Then on the back, we got a triple camera setup with a 50 megapixel main camera, a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera, and a 2 megapixel macro camera. So in general, as far as features go, while it unfortunately doesn't have an ultra wide camera, it has pretty much everything else. I mean, at least we are getting a macro camera, so if you want to get close-up detailed images with this phone, you can. And with a 50 megapixel camera, you can definitely get some pretty good regular photos too. To give you an idea of what it can do, here's some pictures taken with the main camera. For what it is, definitely good in my opinion. Sure, if you're taking a lot of pictures and you want top of the line studio quality, then you're probably going to want to spend a bit more and just get something higher end in general. But for a more entry level affordable phone, if you're taking pictures for like social media, for example, I do think this phone's perfectly fine for something like Instagram. And then of course, for stuff like your own memories, you don't really need a crazy good camera. So unless you really want an ultra wide camera or you want super high quality, that's pretty much going to be out of the price range of this phone anyway. I feel like for any other situation, the camera we're getting here is going to be perfectly fine. Now when it comes to RAM and processor, with the Moto G Power 2022, we are getting 4GB of RAM with the MediaTek Helio G37 processor. Interestingly enough, I actually just got the Motorola Moto G Play 2023 that seems to have the same processor. For some reason, that phone's a lot slower than this one. But with this phone, when it comes to performance, it's definitely not the best if you're going to be on your phone all day, especially doing more demanding activities. But for more basic stuff like web browsing, social media, watching the occasional video every now and then. As long as you're not going to be on your phone all day, I do think you will get a decent experience here. And for a more entry-level 4G phone, especially one that's about a year old, it is decently fast. I don't really want to call this a fast phone because it's not, but I want to say compared to the average sub $200 phone, it is still a bit faster. It's around as fast as something like the TCL 30XL or the Samsung Galaxy A03s. I want to say it's a little bit faster than those phones, but the performance is definitely in that entry-level tier. But in general, for more basic use, if you're not really going to be on your phone a lot and you're doing more simple activities, the performance is going to be perfectly fine. But if performance is a bit more important to you, then just keep in mind, even in this price range, you can pretty easily get a phone that's a bit faster. I mean, in 2023, 5G phones are becoming more and more affordable. So if you are looking for a phone that has better performance, I might suggest looking into something like a Samsung Galaxy A14 5G, for example. And if you really don't care about 5G and you just want a really affordable 4G phone, then even the Moto G Stylus 2022 is probably going to be a little bit better than this. But again, if performance isn't really a huge priority for you and you just need something affordable that works, then just keep in mind the performance we're getting here is at least decent. And compared to a lot of the other phones like it, performance-wise at least, it is surprisingly among the better options. Now, I did run a benchmark test on this phone using Geekbench 5, and here are the results I got. So what I recommend doing is running this test on your current phone and then comparing your results to these, and that's going to give you a better idea of whether or not this phone's actually going to be a performance upgrade for you, because depending on what you're coming from, it may or may not be. But in general, again, for more basic activities and more occasional light use, I do think for most people, you will get a pretty decent experience here. Now for the battery, that's kind of what this phone is known for. With the Moto G Power 2022, we are getting a 5000 mAh battery, so definitely a really large battery. So you can expect to get some great battery life and longevity here. Now, that being said, at this point in 2023, and honestly even in 2022 when this phone originally came out, a 5000 mAh battery really isn't rare, and especially at this point, I feel like it's more or less an expectation that a phone has one. Now that's not to say that something like a 4500 mAh battery is going to give you terrible battery life, because in general in real life when you're actually using the phone, it's not going to be that bad, but just keep in mind if you do want really good battery life, this is something you're really going to get with the Moto G Power. As far as the software goes, that is a pretty big drawback with this phone, because this phone unfortunately does have Android 11, and I'm not even expecting this phone to get Android 12, let alone Android 13. So if having the latest software is more important to you, then keep in mind, this is definitely not going to be a great option. And at that point, I would definitely recommend something like a Samsung Galaxy A series, because while I'm sure this is going to change pretty soon, as of the recording of this video, when it comes to entry-level phones, Samsung Galaxy A series phones are actually the only ones I know of that actually have Android 13, so definitely keep this in mind. But in general, if the software isn't that important to you, then just keep in mind, Android 11 does run decently well on this phone, so I guess it's not really that bad. In addition to this, keep in mind, with the Moto G Power 2022, we're not getting NFC, so if you like to use tap and pay, unfortunately you can't do that with this phone, and at this point in 2023, I feel like pretty much every phone should have NFC, because with contactless mobile payment services becoming more and more popular and widely used, not even having the option to use tap and pay is a pretty big disappointment. But that being said, of course, if you just don't ever see yourself using that feature, then I guess it won't be that bad. Now taking a look at the overall design, it does look decent with this phone. Again, I am a big fan of the hole punch design for the front-facing camera. The bezels are okay and the phone looks decently modern. I feel like they could be a little bit thinner, but again, for being more of an entry-level phone, it is at least okay. The back is made of a sort of matte material that has kind of a wavy texture. Fingerprints don't show up too badly, and it does look cool for the most part, but honestly, in my opinion, I don't think I even noticed this when I first reviewed this phone. But the plastic does feel kind of cheap, the build quality is okay, and the phone does have a decent amount of weight to it. But again, honestly, the materials are a little bit on the cheaper side, so I do recommend putting a case on this phone, because that is going to make this a little bit better. But aside from the materials feeling kind of cheap, the rest of the phone's design is actually pretty good. But in conclusion, my general thoughts about the Motorola Moto G Power 2022. Overall, while this phone is definitely not bad by any means, except for the software I guess, but aside from that, it definitely is pretty decent. I mean, it has plenty of storage, a pretty nice camera, a decent looking display, mostly okay performance, and a really large battery too. So if you're looking for a more entry-level phone for more basic activities, then I do think this phone is going to be an acceptable option, but honestly, compared to most of the phones in this price range, it's pretty much the same. And for around the same price, you can easily get something that has a newer software, similar features, or if you spend a little bit more, depending on the deals and promotions going on at the time, you could probably even get a 5G phone. So on one hand, if you really just want something basic that works, then yeah, this phone is still going to be a perfectly fine option. And in some ways, compared to other phones like it, it may even be a little bit better. But if you really want to maximize the value that you're actually going to get for the money, at this point in 2023, with a lot of really nice 5G phones becoming more and more affordable, I do think if you really want to, you can do better. But if you do want to learn more about this phone, definitely check out the description, where I will be linking to several other videos about it, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Cleepus Tech on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, I will see you in the next video.